Viktor Frankl, another existentialist who became a psychologist. He worked with the most crazy people during World War II, the people who were completely crazy. He himself was in a concentration camp for a year and a half. His wife was killed in the concentration camp. His 2 children were killed. He came out of it and devoted his life as a psychologist, Jew, to particularly to concentration camp survivors, but anybody who completely lost their mind from the war and from suffering and tragedies during the war, is where he spent all his time after having gone through those tragedies in his life. A side little story that maybe give you an idea of Viktor Frankl. He was in a conference once, and people were talking about existentialism. Somebody used the idea of a boomerang. He says, like a boomerang, and if you know how to throw it, and then it comes back to you. And Viktor Frankl, brilliantly at the moment, instantaneously said, I've been to Australia, and I've seen how the boomerangs work. They only come back to you when you miss. Meaning, and which he specified afterwards. The human being, only when you come back to yourself and you notice how you feel in the circumstance and what you want from it in your own personal dynamics with the thing, when you notice that you're back here, aware of yourself, you've missed. You're no longer in the context of the moment.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Just to show you how brilliant, witty he is, it's a perfect analogy. So, it's like a boomerang, and it comes back and it's cool. That's kind of a mysterious, mystical thing. And when it comes, you only get the boomerang back when you miss. When you come back to yourself and you notice, I had a hard day and I didn't like what Eli said, and I feel that you missed. Make sense?
That's a lovely image.
Yes, ma'am.
I remember when I've read the book long ago, but there was one passage in the first part of his book when he talks about being in the camp.
Yes.
And I think he's asked how he didn't lose hope.
Yes.
And he described those watching, I don't remember if it was snow or burn.
He was walking through the snow. They were marching, the Germans were marching all of the prisoners through the snow. They had to go get wood and bring it back into the concentration camp. And he hadn't seen his wife, and he knew his wife was going to die, or he may never see her again. Recalling her and the full bodily involvement in recollecting experiences with her, he achieved the greatest joy of his life. He was in the greatest sustained revelation of joy in his life. Recalling and placing his bodily sensations, even in the midst of his suffering and the probable never going to see her again, with this tremendous revelation that he then built his whole thing on. Whatever your level of suffering is, you can recall the beauties that were given to you, and those are still alive. They are still alive. And there's a spiritual connection there. And I can celebrate and be with this woman, even though I'm not, and may never ever be. And that was the highest experience of his life. And his key revelation from which, so there's a story of they were trudging through the snow, through hours and hours to get the wood, to bring it back into the thing, and he was crying, and people were falling, and they were killing people who fell. Right during this whole thing, he's walking, and he just had this thing, and because of the yearning and the longing, you have that passionate, and all these other things in the proximity to death. Death is not abstract. The importance of the proximity to death, right next to you, and just the totality of that, the proximity to death and the life. Does that make sense? You can see how the importance of death relative to that. Literally, you're saying, someone fell down next to him, they didn't even come up to pick him up, someone just went, shot him in the head, and he sees that, and you're going through this whole thing. Talk about passion, commitment, the moment, full bodily involvement. Expanded on these themes, Viktor, through his reflections on the individual's need to recognize and fulfill the highest expression of their world design. This is what I see the world to be. Here's my own philosophy of what I see the world to be. Meaning in life derives from achieving that self-expression, and striving to find deeper meaning in one's life is the primary spiritual motivational force in human beings. What he called their will to meaning. You make meaning happen through your will to make it happen. You will it. You will meaning. You don't wait for it to be told. You will it into being. When this grand will to meaning is frustrated by life circumstances or your circumstance or ignored, I'm not going to look there. I got other things to do. The individual experiences what is called by all the existentialists as existential frustration. Then the life energy is projected down into lower dimension of a will to power, ambition, gain, manipulation. Yeah, the will to accumulate power and manipulate power. Or lower still to the dimension of a will to pleasure, the will to gather pleasure, to take pleasure, to go from one pleasure to another. Doesn't have any meaning. It's just there's a bath, there's a pretty walk, there's a good television show, there's an Armani suit, Thus, without an existential sense of meaning, these dimensions are experienced exclusively as a manifestation of neuroses. Pleasure is not an end in itself, but rather a byproduct of having done something meaningful. Likewise, power is a means to an end that is attained by using power in a meaningful way. So there's value in pleasure, there's value in power, but only if they exist with this meaning. Highly important in Frankl's view of the human condition is the difference between biologically rooted drives that push us and intuitively rooting yearnings that pull us. Wow. There's a difference between the two. Especially the inner freedom of choice to transcend, especially the inner freedom of choice under any circumstance, to transcend the narrow limits of self-interest by accepting a perspective that liberates us from self-serving attachments and identifications.